In the character universe that is Silicon Valley, there are some shady people. And then there's Elizabeth Holmes. It's 1984. Thriller is all over the radio. The space shuttle Discovery launches for the first time, and Ronald Reagan is president.
Tear down this wall.
Elsewhere in Washington, D.C., Elizabeth Holmes is born. Her father, Christian Rasmus Holmes IV, is vice president of Enron, which becomes a little ironic later in the story. She attended high school in Houston at St. John's. Her classmates remember her as detached from the group and always focused on her work. She took Mandarin and claims to have started her first business selling C++ compilers to Chinese universities. Holmes applies to Stanford University and studies chemical engineering. 2003. She files her first patent application for a wearable drug delivery patch, and by March 2004, she had dropped out of Stanford to start a consumer healthcare technology company, Real-Time Cures, later changed to Theranos because cures sounded too dubious. She wanted to perform blood tests using 1/100th to 1/1000th the normal amount of blood. When Holmes pitched the idea to her medicine professor and his peers, they all said it was impossible. But in the true spirit of Silicon Valley, impossible is nothing, and by December she'd raised over $6 million. Coming up with an idea and then selling it in hopes you can eventually make it work is not uncommon in Silicon Valley. The thing is, there's usually some proof it will work, but nonetheless, by 2010, they had raised over $92 million in venture capital funding without a working product. 2011. Holmes is introduced to former Secretary of State George Shultz. After only 2 hours, he joins the board of directors. Theranos was recognized for having the most illustrious board in U.S. corporate history, and for the next 2 years, they operated silently. They didn't have any press releases, they didn't have a website, nobody really knew what was going on behind closed doors. Then, in September 2013, Theranos announced a partnership with Walgreens, putting their first edition Edison machine in over 40 stores across Arizona. Okay, I've just realized I haven't actually told you what the machines do. At this point, they have two products, their analysis machine, the Edison, and their collection vessel, the Nanotainer. 2014. Theranos now has a $9 billion valuation with over $400 million in venture capital. They also have agreements with Capital Blue Cross, Cleveland Clinic, and Amiri Health to use their products. Holmes appears on the cover of Fortune, Forbes, and the New York Times, among others, being recognized as the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. President Obama appoints her global ambassador for entrepreneurship. As you can see, she's wearing a black turtleneck, very similar to Steve Jobs. She idolized Jobs, even going as far to take some pages out of his book, once pitting two teams against each other in product development, a day shift and a night shift. The main difference between her and Steve is that the losing team would be fired. She also did a TED Talk.
I can buy a tank, which a quick search of the internet has informed me, and I quote, is generally available for any budget or situation.
As you can tell from that clip, she has a very low baritone voice. According to some of her employees, that's actually fake, and her actual voice is a few octaves higher. 2015. John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal publishes a highly critical article exposing the Edison blood test device for giving inaccurate results. Theranos was in fact using commercially available machines for most of its testing. Holmes, of course, denied all claims.
This is what happens when you work to change things, and first they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world.
2016. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services bans Holmes from owning or operating a lab for 2 years after they find irregularities in their staff and facilities. Walgreens also cut all ties to Theranos and closed its in-store blood collection centers. Along with this, the FDA ordered them to stop using their capillary tube nanotainer device, one of their core inventions. By 2017, everything was starting to fall apart. Theranos settled with the state of Arizona after they filed a lawsuit claiming concealing or misrepresentation of data for a total of $4.9 million. Civil and criminal investigations by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of California continue. If you're not sure what's going on, basically Theranos' machines don't work accurately, so they're either giving patients false information or doing their tests on standard machines. Which from a patient's perspective, if you're on a normal machine, is totally fine. But from the perspective of the investors, is terrible. March 14th, 2018. Holmes settles with the SEC on charges of fraud. Theranos also claimed to have $100 million in revenue for 2014, when in fact it was only $100,000, which, if you think about it, is only like 3 less zeros, so really not that far off. Fortunately for her, she escaped jail time, but had to surrender voting control of Theranos, was fined $500,000, and was banned from holding an officer position at a public company for 10 years. At its height, Theranos had more than 800 employees. By August 2018, it had less than 24. But it was about to get worse, because on June 15, 2018, Holmes and former Theranos COO and president Ramesh Sunny Balwani are indicted on 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. See, something I've learned from mafia movies is that the government will always get you eventually. If they fail on their first charge, they'll find a new one. Prosecutors allege that Holmes and Balwani engaged in 2 criminal schemes, one to defraud investors, the other to defraud doctors and patients. The case is proceeding at the U.S. District Court of San Jose. They both have pleaded not guilty and face up to 20 years in prison. In my opinion, Elizabeth Holmes started Theranos in hopes she could find herself a place in the Silicon Valley Hall of Fame. And as it became clear that her product wasn't going to work, she tried to stretch it out for as long as possible in hopes that they could eventually create a working device. Nonetheless, they did defraud investors, and she just seems like a very strange person. The whole low voice and dressed like Steve Jobs thing is, I don't know, it just kind of creeps me out. Anyway, that was the summarized version. There's a lot more to this story. For example, George Shultz, who was on the original board of directors, his nephew Tyler Shultz ended up being one of the whistleblowers on this company. Apparently he'd gone to George and told him that it was all a big sham, and George had kind of just dismissed it, but eventually changed his view. There's also the interesting fact that Elizabeth and Sunny Balwani were romantically involved. They met at Stanford. I believe he was 19 years older than her. I don't know, there's a lot more to it. If you're interested, I strongly suggest you check it out. And as always, thanks for watching.